I've always felt as though WHOMP'S Fortress carried the weight of being the first real stage of Mario 64. Bob-omb Battlefield, for all of its charm and accomplishments, felt more like an extension of the implicit tutorial that began out in the castle grounds. It was a stage meant to teach you the laws and rules of Mario 64, and what it meant to complete a stage or collect a star. This is largely why it had no bottomless pits, because the stage designers wanted you to experiment and learn how to play the game in Bob-omb Battlefield. So they had to ease you into the challenge of the game. In WHOMP'S Fortress, you're immediately taken to the next level because not only are there bottomless pits, but the routes are a lot narrower and require you to really learn to comfortably control Mario to succeed. A control that you needed in Bob-omb Battlefield, but in WHOMP'S Fortress, failure to master that control can often lead to a loss of a life. Additionally, I think the aesthetic in WHOMP'S Fortress sticks out just a bit more than Bob-omb Battlefield, where that stage just feels like a vast and open grassy world that can be pasted into most platformers of the time. WHOMP'S Fortress has a more iconic layout and landmark that visually has more memorable characteristics. And I don't think that's a reach either. When they decided to steer into nostalgia in Mario Galaxy, they didn't bring back the battlefield, they brought back WHOMP'S Fortress, and I think that is specifically for the reasons I just mentioned. It just all around does a better job feeling like a true first stage of the game, even though you can't access it until after you collect at least one star. As far as the layout is concerned, the stage borrows the same philosophy of Bob-omb Battlefield, where you're meant to follow somewhat of a linear path up the fortress and ultimately face off against a boss at the top of the fortress. And once again, similar to Bob-omb Battlefield, you have a few different options of routes you can take with the varying locations that you can veer off and explore. But the level design will naturally force you to gravitate back to the main path on a first-time playthrough. You start off in a lower grassy area, at the foot of the fortress, which will have some patches of flowers that contain piranha plants. The catch is they're sleeping, which means in order to not awaken and anger them, you have to carefully walk past them. Only then will you be able to comfortably land a blow on them and defeat them. When you're done exploring the grassy area, you'll likely want to head up the incline path, and there are two routes you could take. One of them requires you to use a wall jump or a backflip to climb. The reward for mastering these more advanced maneuvers is a simpler path. Otherwise, you're going to have to maneuver around obstacles and bottomless pits and even thwomps to move up the fortress. A first-time player might struggle with the higher jump, especially a younger first-time player. But if they put in the effort, then the route with the fewer risks is much more rewarding. Before continuing up the fortress, you'll end up in a pool. I have a lot of nostalgia for this pool. This is basically the first area of Mario 64 I ever saw with my own eyes when I saw an older kid playing it at Toys R Us. And for some reason I vividly remember this pool in the TV commercials back then too. You can't actually swim here, it's all shallow, and I think for the most part it's just meant to show off the cool water physics. There are a few coins you can collect, and I think that's mostly to regain some health in case you fall from higher up on the fortress. If you're the explorer type, you might find the side area with the cannon and get rewarded for your exploration with a blue coin block too. But just as before, at some point you'll likely want to continue your traversal up the fortress. Next, you'll notice an area you can't quite jump to yet. As you get better in the game, this will serve as a shortcut rewarded for players that have mastery of Mario's controls. Areas like this are riddled throughout the game, where a first-time player will most certainly lose a life, but a seasoned veteran will get through it without a thought. It's basically a checkpoint for returning players, and that logic applies to warp locations as well, which you'll likely accidentally discover because they'll be placed in locations you're realistically going to stop in if you're simply exploring. In order to continue along the path, you'll have to pass by a piranha plant. The space is narrower now, so you'd have to be careful. Luckily, if you practice on the piranha plants in a lower field, this should be easy. Next, you'll have two challenges to face, both of which offer their own unique experience. Either you scoot across the narrow path on the wall and attack the piranha plant blocking your path, or you can take a long jump or run across the blocks that drop as soon as you step on them so you can't slow down at all, followed by passing by a narrow bridge. Both of these challenges are actually likely to get a hold of you the first few times you play. Multiple routes, both with a different type of challenge, and both will teach you to better control the mustachioed plumber. And you'll probably fall a few times. If you get by those, you get to move across a revolving platform. You'll notice the drop down below lands you on a slope rather than a flat ground. This is because the game expects you to fall down during this challenge, and you might already be low on health because of the piranha plants on your way here. So rather than being a frustrating death trap, when you land on the slope you won't lose any health. Instead, your punishment will once again be standing in the pool of water and having to work your way back up, over and over again. Beyond that, it's a pretty straight shot minus some WHOMP'S that will try to crush you. And you'll quickly figure out when they're flat on the floor, that's your chance to ground pound them and defeat them. You'll make it to some rising platforms that will take you up to face off against WHOMP himself. Defeating him is pretty straightforward. He goes down the same way the smaller WHOMP'S went down. 3 hits and he's done. And you'll have your first star. Aptly titled, Chip Off the WHOMP'S Block. When you start the second objective, the stage will transform, but only on the location on top where the WHOMP fight took place, which means you're going to have to go through the whole stage again for a second time. For similar reasons I mentioned during my discussion in Bob-omb's Battlefield, I don't think this was necessarily a bad decision when they created the game, because I think it was vital that players would learn to control Mario, and going through these routes twice is a pretty good way to test that skill, especially when you consider there are multiple disconnecting and reconnecting branches along the route. So this serves as a chance to learn the routes you didn't take the first time. So while it may seem tedious on a repeat playthrough to have to start all over again from the bottom of the fortress, I think it was a necessary design element when this game was created, and I still find it to be useful to this day. Also, like I said, there are shortcuts that an experienced player will take, so it won't even set you back all that much. When you make it to the top, you'll notice a newly constructed tower and just a whole lot more commotion and obstacles all around you. Your goal is to face this minor challenge of platforming and dodging to get to the top of the tower, where you will receive the second power star. Next up is Shoot into the Wild Blue. Similar to Bob-omb Battlefield, this is meant to be a cannonball star, but more advanced players have figured out that you can just wall jump and grab it. This one is a bit more tough. Thankfully, the game throws a climbing pole for you to aim for, so you're not just shooting and praying for a perfect shot to the star. Next up is Red Coin atop the floating aisle. There are 6 red coins along the routes you've already taken. Only this star will require you to search for them and get comfortable with the varying aspects of the stage, like jumping on the bursting blocks from the wall or standing on the top of the thwomp as he rises up, comfortably defeating the piranha plants if you haven't already figured that out, and being able to swing around a rotating platform without falling off. But the name of the star is atop the floating aisle, and that's because when you get to the top of WHOMP'S fortress, you'll have to kick down a standing plank of wood to create a narrow bridge, which will require you to carefully platform along the islands to grab the 2 remaining coins. This is probably the most difficult area in the stage. You'll notice a cage right next to you which will contain the 5th star. You might think this means you're meant to make your way back up to the aisle again to get into the cage, but the jump into that cage is very difficult. That's because this star is meant to be collected by flying up there with the owl and dropping into the cage, which is much easier said than done on a first time go around. Whenever you figure out the owl is in the tree, you'll hopefully know that it's the only real way to fall into the cage since it's the highest location in the fortress. After that, the final star is basically a puzzle. You have to blast away the wall. I am curious to know how people figured this one out. I still vividly remember seeing my older brother grabbing it, but I'm not sure if he figured it out on his own or if a friend told him. I mean, in hindsight, it seems pretty simple. You're blasting, so you should naturally head towards the cannon. And once you do, there are only so many walls you can aim for. But I think this one is a bit harder to figure out without some help. Beyond that, it's a 100 coin collection star. Probably the easiest or second easiest stage to collect 100 coins in. It's a small area, fairly simple to traverse, every whomp you defeat gives you 5 coins, and the blue coin block alone will give you 20 coins, and they're fairly easy to collect within the allotted time limit. It's a good challenge for players going for the full 120 stars because it allows them to search the entire stage in a deeper lens than those that are simply trying to get the 8 red coins. In general, I don't feel like any of the stars are really overtly repetitive on a first time playthrough. The design here borrows from Bob-omb Battlefield in that your first star is just meant to give you a general scope of the stage as you rise towards the top. The second star, while yes would be easier to nab if you start from where the first star ended, allows you to repeat the stage and take alternate routes and challenges that you may have not faced the first time around. The third star requires the use of the cannon, which for the most part is easier to access from the start of the stage rather than from where the other 4 stars end. Because the 4th star is a red coin scavenger hunt, so it makes sense that you start at the beginning of the stage for that. And the 5th star requires the owl, which again is right at the start of the stage. And the final star requires the cannon to blast into the wall, which I would say is probably similar to the Chain Chomp star in Bob-omb's Battlefield in that you should be able to really just grab that one while going through the stage, since it's more or less along your path, as long as you figure out how to solve the puzzle. Even though the cannon is fairly easy to access from the start of the stage, but I can yield it. Which means from the 2 stages, I'd say there are only really 2 out of the 14 stars that feel super redundant or somewhat like padding due to the fact that you always have to leave the stage and re-enter. Whereas the rest of them feel like they fit in with the formula of the game and that it naturally exits a first-time player back to the hub to allow them to either go and play another stage, explore the castle, or jump back into the painting for a fresh start in the stage without having to reorient themselves in a stage they haven't completely memorized yet. But anyway, I think WHOMP'S Fortress is a lot of fun. Where Bob-omb Battlefield seemed to have focused more on the collecting and searching aspect of the game due to its safer and larger layout, WHOMP'S Fortress focuses a lot more on your ability to control Mario and maneuver not only around stage hazards, but unique enemies. I haven't really discussed Mario's controls and cameras all that much yet, but the stage does give you ample challenges to learn how to comfortably adapt all of the varying quirks in relation to controlling both the camera and Mario himself. For a first-time entrance in the 3rd dimension, this was critical for players to learn how to be comfortable in a 3D space. And even more for modern gamers revisiting a control system that isn't quite as intuitive as Mario Odyssey. WHOMP'S Fortress can be the gateway stage that allows them to adjust for the intricate changes in the control style. I don't know if I'll really go in depth into Mario's controls. Maybe I'll speak a bit more about them in the conclusion of this retrospective. But I will remind you all that I'm the same person that went through all of the Sonic games and didn't mind any of the drastic changes in the controls, because after 1 or 2 levels, I was able to adapt and enjoy the game without shrugging it off as a failure because it didn't feel exactly like I wanted it to feel. And Mario 64 is more similar to something like Odyssey than Sonic Heroes or Shadow of 5 are to Shadow Generations. So if I was fine with it there, then you can be certain I'm going to be fine with the adjustment here. I think I can acknowledge that Mario has controlled better than Mario 64. I would hope he did. Mario 64 is pushing 30 years soon. But I can also enjoy the game and its controls for what they are and not scoff at them for the sake of scoffing at them, and blowing their outdated implementation out of proportion just because I had to spend a few minutes adapting to them. That's just the way I approach video games. So if you're looking for the punchline where I say all you youngins are right, and Mario 64 has crappy controls and a crappy camera and is not playable today, well, that's not happening because quite frankly, I don't really believe it's true. But anyway, it's time to head over to Jolly Roger Bay.